Senator John Kennedy just effectively dismantled Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on live television, turning what she arrogantly assumed was her crowning moment into the most humiliating 40 minutes of her entire political career. Staring directly at the veteran lawmaker from Louisiana during a primetime broadcast, the progressive firebrand flashed a confident smile and delivered the exact line she never should have uttered, unaware that she had just handed her opponent the very blade he would use to politically dissect her. That fatal blind spot has consistently plagued Ocasio-Cortez. She fundamentally lacks the self-awareness to distinguish between an audience eating out of the palm of her hand and a catastrophic trap snapping shut. The battleground was a standard cable news setup, featuring 2 seats and a single moderator, an arena the Congresswoman eagerly embraced because she viewed the television camera as her ultimate personal weapon. Heavily armed with 13 million loyal followers and a unique talent for generating endless viral soundbites for every single news cycle, she simply did not lose in these controlled environments. Conversely, Kennedy agreed to appear for a remarkably straightforward reason, casually mentioning to appear beforehand that he merely intended to pose a handful of simple questions. Despite frantic warnings from his own team and a stark caution from his wife that the media would devour him alive, the Southern statesman simply offered a slow, knowing grin. The moderator rolled out the red carpet for the representative, enthusiastically introducing her as the trailblazing youngest woman ever elected to Congress, who was single-handedly reshaping the entire Democratic establishment with her massive army of 13 million digital disciples. Kennedy's introduction, however, was a blunt, single-sentence acknowledgement of his status as a Republican senator from Louisiana. This glaring disparity in respect was calculated, a detail the veteran lawmaker quietly absorbed and filed away without uttering a single complaint. Wasting no time, Ocasio-Cortez seized total control of the narrative before the opening inquiry even concluded. She played her greatest hits with undeniable skill, passionately railing against systemic wealth gaps, impending environmental doom, and the tragic plight of working-class citizens forced into the impossible choice between purchasing life-saving insulin and paying their monthly rent. Slicing fiercely through the studio space, her hands furiously directed an invisible symphony that only she could hear. Pivoting aggressively toward her conservative counterpart, she delivered a stinging rebuke, claiming, with all due respect, that entrenched politicians, exactly like him, had occupied the nation's capital for decades, while accomplishing nothing beyond altering the typeface on useless bureaucratic memos. Allowing the insult to permeate the studio, the anchor nodded approvingly, deliberately granting the Congresswoman a triumphant beat of silence to let the attack land, while pointedly refusing to press Kennedy for an immediate rebuttal. The sheer bias of the broadcast was palpable, immediately recognized by ordinary families tuning in from living rooms across Ohio, Georgia, and Louisiana, who quietly noted the blatant media tilt as they waited for a response. Tapping a subtle rhythm on his knee with 2 fingers, Kennedy patiently allowed the awkward quiet to stretch just a beat past comfortable before dryly remarking that her tirade was certainly something to behold. Pausing for another calculated second, he claimed to be nothing more than a simple guy from Louisiana, politely asking the confident representative if she might help him understand a few basic concepts. Smirking slightly, she assumed he was merely stalling for time, deeply convinced that she had already conquered the debate by openly branding him a fossil on national television. Coasting heavily on the aggressive high of her initial monologue, Ocasio-Cortez confidently unleashed the specific talking point that would ultimately seal her fate. Staring directly into the camera lens rather than engaging her opponent, she aggressively championed her sweeping Green New Deal as the most ambitious climate legislation in American history, boldly accusing her critics of prioritizing corporate profits over the survival of the planet. She delivered this grand declaration with the trademark certainty of an elite who has never once been forced to mathematically justify her utopian demands. Offering a polite nod, Kennedy noted that such grand ambition was fantastic, playfully recalling a time his own grandson planned to construct a cardboard spacecraft out of a refrigerator box. While he appreciated the grand vision, he noted gently, he just had a few lingering questions regarding the actual engineering. A smattering of chuckles broke out across the room, though the Congresswoman remained stone-faced. Pressing forward, the senator simply asked her to help him with the basic math, demanding to know exactly how much her monumental climate proposal would cost. Dodging the direct inquiry, she immediately reframed the initiative as a mandatory investment in our collective future, arguing that the financial impact of ignoring climate change would be incalculable. Refusing to take the bait, he acknowledged her talking point but relentlessly circled back, pressing her on the exact price tag of the specific legislative plan bearing her name. As she attempted to pivot yet again toward the estimated costs of governmental inaction, his tone remained strikingly calm. That was the brilliance of John Kennedy that the media cameras consistently missed and written transcripts forever failed to convey. When he went in for the kill, his voice dropped to a whisper rather than an explosive shout. Clarifying his position, he insisted he was not asking about the price of doing nothing, but rather the exact financial burden of acting upon her specific legislative scheme. Rather than producing a concrete figure, she instantly retreated into her signature rhetoric of apocalyptic urgency and existential crisis, deploying the exact language that had originally catapulted her to superstardom. Waiting patiently, the seasoned lawmaker finally crunched the numbers himself, breaking down the math with the methodical, agonizing pace of a cashier counting out loose change at a register. Noting that widespread estimates consistently pegged the total cost at roughly $93 trillion, he divided that massive sum by the nation's roughly 330 million citizens, calculating a staggering individual burden of approximately $280,000 per person. Wondering aloud what they currently taught in the economics department at Boston University, he flatly stated that in the real world where he comes from, slapping a working-class citizen with a $280,000 invoice guarantees they will demand to see exactly what they just ordered. Instantly, her famous hands shot into the air, fiercely chopping, pointing, and sweeping as she deployed the exact same frantic gestures her 13 million fans had watched 1,000 times before. She furiously accused him of treating minority suffering and environmental destruction like a trivial parlor game while communities of color were actively being destroyed and the planet literally burned around them. Sitting motionless, Kennedy allowed her theatrical, high-volume outrage to wash over him, embodying the stoic calm of a man sitting on a porch watching a violent thunderstorm pass by. Once the studio was quiet again, he calmly validated her emotional plea, acknowledging that he heard her loud and clear, but ruthlessly pointed out that when he asked for a financial estimate, she responded with a lecture about people dying, which are two different sentences. Jumping instantly to the progressive star's defense, the moderator leaned in and awkwardly suggested that atmospheric policy involves much more than simple arithmetic. Without even glancing at the biased anchor, the senator politely agreed, but noted that the numerical data is the exact part where an actual human being has to write a massive check. And those very taxpayers were currently glued to their screens watching this debate unfold, glaring at him with the furious intensity of a boxer whose opponent simply refuses to swing back. She found herself out of her element. She was flawlessly engineered for fierce confrontation, for deafening volume, and for the exact kind of rhetorical street fights where the fastest, loudest voice automatically claims victory. But her adversary wasn't brawling, he was casually counting, leaving her defenseless because she had no idea how to strike a man wielding a calculator instead of a clenched fist. Desperate, she aggressively pivoted hard, utilizing the exact same aggressive redirection she always deployed whenever the political terrain shifted underneath her boots, choosing to launch a highly personal attack. Mocking his comfortable television appearances on Fox News, she accused him of lounging in his leather chair, making cheap jokes while having never accomplished a single thing for the blue-collar workforce. Flexing her own working-class origin story, she proudly recalled rising from nothing to serve drinks to exhausted patrons who worked significantly harder in one single shift than he did in an entire month, fiercely insisting she battled for those forgotten laborers every single day. Give her credit, the brutal counterattack landed with genuine force, fueled heavily by the authentic memories of long shifts, ungrateful customers, wiped-down tables, and hard-earned tips counted late at night. The studio audience visibly swayed in her direction as the moderator nodded, allowing the young lawmaker to briefly reclaim her favorite throne of righteous indignation. Slowly nodding in agreement, Kennedy conceded the vicious attack, dryly admitting that he hadn't passed many massive bills and joking that his own wife had been mercilessly reminding him of that exact failure for 30 years. The entire room chuckled at his self-deprecating charm, but the senator's face remained deadly serious. Shifting gears, he casually noted her passionate defense of the working class before delivering a surgical strike, observing that actual working people are forced to pay for their own dresses. Visibly rattled, her entire expression shifted as she demanded immediate clarification. He brought up her infamous appearance at the elite Met Gala, complimenting the clever tax the rich slogan plastered on her back, but dismantling the staggering hypocrisy behind the stunt. He meticulously pointed out that while the exclusive entry ticket cost an astonishing $35,000, she received the luxurious garment, professional hairstyling, and elite makeup free of charge. Furthermore, he highlighted that when the House Ethics Committee flagged unpaid expenses regarding the lavish event, she quickly threw her own campaign team under the bus, claiming her staff mishandled the vendor issues. Leaning in, he shocked the room by revealing his own long-ago history working behind a bar, noting that when the cash register came up short at the end of a grueling night, the proprietor never blamed the hired help. He took personal responsibility because his name was on the building. Letting that truth sit heavy in the air, he dismantled her populist image, stating that ordinary families sitting at home notice when a politician claims to fight for them while partying at an exclusive gala that costs significantly more than most civilian vehicles. They see the blinding hypocrisy of wearing complimentary designer clothes, demanding higher taxes, only to conveniently blame underling assistants when the invoice finally arrives, because those exact working-class folks pay for their own garments and never receive $35,000 freebies to anything. Her hands flew into overdrive, gesturing wider and faster as she desperately tried to reframe the humiliating critique as a massive distraction from systemic social failures, furious that he would dare reduce an entire generational movement down to a single piece of fabric. Waiting with the patience of a man fishing in a tiny pond where the catch has nowhere to hide, he let her thrash. She claimed to defend the working man, yet he simply asked who footed the bill for her extravagant lifestyle. Dropping the wild hand gestures entirely, her voice lowered as her eyes locked onto him with a more dangerous, authentic fury. Leaning aggressively forward, she questioned his audacity to challenge her personal integrity. She mercilessly dragged his political career, noting he had occupied government office since she was sitting in kindergarten 30 years ago. Yet his home state of Louisiana still suffered from one of the highest poverty rates in the nation. She brutally accused him of never authoring a single piece of major legislation that became actual law, claiming he merely chased cheap laughs and viral clips on television before retreating to a state where innocent children continuously went to bed hungry. Stripping away the theatrical performance, she was now engaged in a visceral, bare-knuckle brawl. She proudly boasted about entering federal office at age 29, carrying massive student debt, zero financial backing, no political dynasty, and no elite law firm connections, yet still managing to push the largest climate legislation in American history during her very first term. She aggressively credited herself with expanding the child tax credit that supposedly lifted millions of impoverished children out of the gutter and forced an entire nation to have conversations it had aggressively avoided for decades. Staring him down with an unshakable glare, she brilliantly weaponized his own mathematical metaphor against him, boldly declaring that while he sat there passively dividing massive numbers, she had spent every waking moment multiplying real-world impact since the day she took her oath of office. The brutal comeback hit harder than anything she had unleashed all night, entirely flipping the momentum and leaving the progressive icon looking victorious for a clean, untouchable 15 seconds. Jumping immediately back into the fray, the anchor eagerly assisted the Congresswoman, pressuring the veteran lawmaker to name a single major law he had personally shepherded into existence over his 3 decades in power. Ordinary Americans watching at home instantly recognized the blatant media bias, grinding their teeth as the establishment network sharpened the progressive darling's blade for her and handed her an extra round of ammunition. Yet, they remained paralyzed in front of their screens, unable to change the channel because the old Southern statesman simply sat there, rhythmically tapping his knee and refusing to elevate his pitch. Offering a solemn, quiet nod, his response was so profoundly soft it demanded attention. He fully admitted his state's deep-rooted, massive problems and openly confessed his failure to resolve most of them, once again invoking his wife's 30 years of criticism to effortlessly disarm the heavy tension. A warm, soft ripple of laughter swept the studio, the exact kind of laughter that occurs when a man invites you to laugh alongside him rather than at someone else. But his facial expression remained carved from granite. He then exposed the fundamental, fatal flaw in her entire political identity, noting that every single time he asked a concrete, factual question that evening, she responded with a brilliantly crafted, beautifully delivered speech, praising her as genuinely the most gifted orator he had witnessed in Washington over the last 3 decades. He quickly twisted the knife, bluntly stating that poetic rhetoric does not cover the monthly rent. He painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of forgotten Americans hunched over their kitchen tables at that exact moment, using an outdated calculator older than the Congresswoman herself to juggle the brutal, relentless realities of gas, groceries, electricity, and medical expenses. These are the concrete realities that ignore flashy political headlines, and when the numbers fail to balance, ordinary folks don't have the luxury of delivering a passionate monologue about it. They quietly sacrifice, looking their own child in the eye, to deliver the heartbreaking news that they simply must wait until next month, because that is what genuine math actually looks like. Turning completely away from Ocasio-Cortez to speak directly into the camera lens, he honored those invisible citizens, forcefully validating that they are not stupid, they are not dinosaurs, and they are certainly not relics from a forgotten America. They are grinding away at this exact moment, executing the exact same survival tactics they utilized last month, making ends meet with nobody clapping for them, 0 digital followers tracking their progress, and nobody splashing their face on a magazine cover just for paying their utility bill on time. He channeled their deep-seated, profound exhaustion, blasting out-of-touch elites on the other side of the screen who casually dismiss their financial anxieties while having no concept of what it means to genuinely sit at that table and choose between heating a home and feeding a plaque to family while pretending the sacrifice didn't hurt. His profound soliloquy completely bypassed the politician, aimed squarely at the forgotten masses who had spent years waiting for someone holding a microphone to finally articulate their silent, boiling rage. They already knew the brutal truth, they just needed someone brave enough to broadcast it on national television. Every single basic question is met with a theatrical speech that sounds amazing. Yet the actual question remains permanently unanswered. Still aggressively pushing and fighting for dominance, Ocasio-Cortez casually dropped a massive political landmine right into the middle of her own sentence without a second thought, treating the explosive declaration like mundane furniture rather than a catastrophic trap. She proudly declared herself 100% funded by the people, free of shady corporate political action committee cash, smugly wielding this financial purity as her ultimate brand and asserting it was a moral high ground no conservative across the aisle could ever hope to touch. Instead of a fiery rebuttal or a sudden pounce, Kennedy did the last thing anyone expected. He simply leaned deep back into his chair and began weaving a slow, folksy narrative, adopting the deeply comforting, warm cadence of an old friend chatting on a back porch in the evening, completely detached from the need to win an argument. He fondly recalled a hard-working buddy who ran a humble plumbing supply business down in Madisonville. This ordinary man grinded out 7-day work weeks for 20 solid years, kept immaculate financial records, paid every single vendor on time, and never owed a solitary dime he didn't know about, while his wife managed the accounting on a computer significantly older than the Congresswoman's entire political career. Smiling faintly, though the warmth never quite reached his eyes, he described how this friend eventually hired a slick, sharp consultant overflowing with massive visions of expansion, the exact type of grand ideas that make a small-town owner believe his little shop could evolve into an empire. Trusting the newcomer completely, the business owner handed over the keys, only to discover that the slick operator had quietly established a side hustle, shuffling exactly $885,000 through a labyrinth of obscure LLC shell companies. While one side of the ledger looked impeccably clean, the other side hemorrhaged cash to unknown entities under the incredibly vague guise of strategic consulting, a term Kennedy dryly noted usually translates to a polite refusal to explain where the funds actually went. When confronted about the massive missing funds, the consultant offered zero explanation, repeated the phrase strategic consulting, and simply vanished into thin air without even bothering to clean out his desk. After a suffocatingly long, agonizingly slow pause, the senator brought the story crashing violently down onto the congresswoman's lap, explicit Chakrabarti and his controversial firm, Brand New Congress, LLC. He methodically laid out how her trusted right-hand man funneled exactly $885,000 from political action committees they mutually controlled, triggering a massive Federal Election Commission probe that prompted a former chairman to publicly suggest there was ample evidence for a criminal case right before Chakrabarti abruptly resigned. Staring at her with almost clinical, gentle sympathy, resembling a doctor forced to deliver a terminal diagnosis he deeply wishes he could withhold, he noted that while she undoubtedly possessed a perfectly crafted explanation, her social media profile still aggressively claimed she was exclusively funded by grassroots donors. Yet, the massive pile of cash still vanished into the dark exactly where it moved, and the architect of the entire financial scheme was conveniently no longer on her payroll. He gently challenged her to identify any uncomfortable parallels in his little hometown anecdote. The entire atmosphere of the studio instantly shattered into a million pieces. The previously aggressive moderator completely froze, entirely abandoning the progressive star, refusing to redirect the conversation, and leaving her to drown in the deafening silence, waiting the way the American public had been waiting all evening. Her hands weakly fluttered upward, significantly slower and smaller this time, as she desperately attempted to deflect, weakly crying out about hundreds of millions in conservative dark money funneling through the Koch brothers and the Heritage Foundation. Keeping his voice dangerously low, he firmly reminded her that he wasn't asking about the Koch brothers, he was explicitly asking about the massive financial black hole surrounding her own top lieutenant. Panicking as the floor entirely gave way beneath her, she instinctively reached for the most nuclear option in her political playbook, the ultimate rhetorical weapon that had never once failed her since rocketing her to fame in 2019 and dominating every progressive highlight reel since. She loudly invoked the explosive southern border crisis, screaming about the current administration locking innocent immigrant children in cages. She was instantly cut off by the Louisiana senator, who aggressively confirmed her past rhetoric because it was undeniably true that she had used those exact words. He recalled her infamous Instagram broadcast where she explicitly told the entire country that the United States government was actively operating literal concentration camps, recklessly deploying the historically sacred phrase, "never again." He revealed that her inflammatory words had genuinely haunted him and kept him awake that night, citing his own father's military service in a brutal war fought to defend the actual meaning of never again, firmly agreeing with the gravity of the phrase. Having perfectly established the weight of her own horrifying accusations, he meticulously cornered her with precision. He pointed out that when the legislative branch finally proposed a massive $4.5 billion relief package explicitly designed to provide the exact medical care, humanitarian aid, and improved living conditions she claimed were desperately missing from those border facilities, she completely turned her back on it. The legislation was fundamentally designed to fix every single horrifying abuse she had explicitly described. Pausing for maximum bone-chilling effect, he simply asked why she voted no on that exact funding. 7 agonizing seconds of dead air choked the broadcast, the longest, most suffocating silence of the entire evening, a gap so quiet you could actually hear the studio air conditioning hum and a cameraman physically shift his weight. She weakly mumbled about legislative loopholes and expanded provisions before he mercilessly crushed her final, pathetic defense, remaining as quiet, level, and patient as a stone resting at the bottom of a rushing river. He summarized her ultimate betrayal. She screamed to the heavens about concentration camps, demanded the nation pledge never again. Yet when the multi-billion-dollar check finally arrived to solve the terrifying crisis, she explicitly voted no, delivering the final, catastrophic blow. He bluntly stated that she never actually wanted to fix the crisis. She merely wanted to say she cared. Those 8 brutal words hung in the room like thick, suffocating smoke, completely exposing the truth to everybody in the studio and millions watching at home. They all instantly understood that the most famous liberal voice in the entire nation had shamelessly weaponized the Holocaust, strictly to book television appearances, only to block the actual funding because solving a systemic problem does not generate viral internet traffic. Only pure outrage and unhinged fire go viral, and Ocasio-Cortez had built her entire political empire exclusively on fire. Opening her mouth to mount a desperate defense, the words simply died in her throat, marking the first time all evening she completely short-circuited and stopped herself. Not because she was rudely interrupted, but because the sentence literally perished somewhere between her vocal cords and the studio air, replaced by nothing. Instead of throwing her a lifeline, the previously biased anchor adopted a wildly careful, almost gentle tone, politely asking the stunned lawmaker if she cared to actually address the senator's question regarding her legislative vote. Audiences across the country watched in awe as the entire media machine fundamentally broke character right before their eyes. The exact same host who had introduced the progressive star with 3 glowing paragraphs while dismissing Kennedy with 1 sentence. The host who had gleefully nodded along to every theatrical speech, handed out extra beats of silence, and repeatedly interrupted the conservative lawmaker, was now forcing the young radical to directly confront the relentless interrogation. She wasn't offering a softer alternative. She was demanding an answer to the exact same question Kennedy had been flawlessly executing in various forms for 40 minutes. Ordinary families in Louisiana, Ohio, and the forgotten parts of America this elite host had never once visited felt a massive shift in their chests, realizing that for the first time in modern memory, the television establishment was actually fighting on their side. Staring at her without an ounce of anger, but rather something resembling genuine sadness, Kennedy noted the painfully obvious pattern of the evening. That single sentence forced every viewer to instantly rewind the last 40 minutes in their heads. When asked about the monumental cost of her plan, she screamed about people dying while her hands swept wide. When asked who funded her luxury dress, she lectured on systemic inequality while her hands chopped sharper. When pressed on where the massive campaign money vanished, she shrieked about the Koch brothers as her gestures shrank. When demanded to explain her hypocritical border vote, she weakly mentioned children before completely stalling. 4 basic questions resulted in 4 theatrical speeches and 0 factual answers. And her iconic hands, which 13 million people had watched dictate 1,000 furious arguments, grew increasingly paralyzed with every blow, as if her own body realized the futility of the charade. Summarizing the destruction, he accurately noted that every single time he asked a question, she consistently served up a fiery headline. But the actual inquiry remained sitting ignored, waiting endlessly like an unpaid bill on a working-class kitchen table. 4 questions, 4 speeches, 0 answers, with each monologue growing significantly louder than the last, except for the final one which completely flatlined. After an agonizingly long silence, the polished political actor entirely vanished, replaced by a much quieter, rougher, and deeply honest voice that forced the entire room to lean forward, revealing the raw sound of a genuine human being buried underneath all the flashy headlines. She recounted the tragic loss of her father to cancer when she was just 19, the threat of losing their family home, the brutal reality of working double shifts, waitressing and bartending, and the suffocating weight of educational loans with no end in sight. She claimed she stormed the Capitol because the entrenched political elite looked nothing like the exhausted patrons she used to serve drinks to. Allowing her voice to authentically catch, she confessed her glaring imperfections but fiercely defended her abrasive style, insisting she had to scream at the top of her lungs because nobody was listening to the forgotten laborers in her district who desperately worked 2 jobs, couldn't make rent, and skipped meals just so their children could eat. She vowed to aggressively shout every single day until the establishment finally heard their cries. It was a stunningly raw moment, or at least so close to real that the subtle distance didn't even matter, briefly freezing the entire studio in awe. The host looked down at her hands, and a cameraman actually lowered his equipment, offering genuine respect to the overwhelming humanity suddenly displayed in the room. She had just put her entire soul on the table: the dead father, the grueling double shifts, the desperate fight, and the authenticity of her pain was undeniable. Yet, The stoic lawmaker from the South refused to physically move, simply sitting there and waiting. The masterpiece of a response he delivered next is exactly why this clip will be studied and remembered 10 years from now. Refusing to rush the powerful moment, he allowed the heavy silence to hold before speaking in a profoundly different tone, stripping away the folksy drawl, the comedian persona, and the cold arithmetic. He tapped into something far deeper, sounding exactly like a weary man who had once sat at his own kitchen table, staring at a bill he had no idea how to pay, speaking with a heavy gravity that proved his words actually cost him something to say. He genuinely validated her tragic origin story, assuring her that he deeply believed her father passed, respected the brutal double shifts, and admired the incredible hustle required to fight from a bartender's well to a federal office while juggling massive debt by age 29, admitting it was a story worthy of a genuine handshake. But looking down at his own hands before locking eyes with her, he drew a massive, unbridgeable distinction, firmly stating that being aggressively loud is not the same as actually listening, and blindly shouting for vulnerable people is fundamentally different from providing them with concrete answers. He lectured her on basic Southern integrity, explaining that where he comes from, when you promise to deliver, you follow through, not because a camera is rolling or a hashtag is trending, but simply because your word is the only unbreakable currency you possess. That is exactly how he was raised. And that is precisely how the majority of the working-class families watching the broadcast were raised. Circling relentlessly back to the undeniable facts, he gently reminded her of the 4 specific inquiries regarding her monumental climate tax, her elite wardrobe funding, her missing campaign cash, and her wildly hypocritical border vote. While he praised her ability to deliver the type of gorgeously crafted speeches that manufacture instant global fame, he noted that those exhausted families she supposedly champions, the ones who aren't famous and aren't blindly clapping, are still desperately waiting for a single straight answer. Staring at her without an ounce of triumph or anger, but rather a heartbreaking gentleness reserved for when you deeply wish the ugly truth were different, he delivered the ultimate kill shot. He observed that she possesses a brilliant answer for everything in the world, except the actual question asked. Those 10 brutal words sank to the bottom of the room with the finality of a heavy stone dropping down a dry well, confirming just how deep the intellectual silence had truly been all along. What unfolded next was a total psychological collapse that no television camera missed, no viral edit could ever properly cut, and no flashy headline could ever accurately paraphrase because it was defined not by a spoken word, but by the absence of one. The aggressively animated hands that had furiously dictated the flow of the entire 40-minute debate, the hands that had pointed, swept, and conducted every single syllable of her practiced outrage, the iconic gestures synonymous with her endless fight, suddenly fell dead. They dropped straight to her lap, palms resting flat against the fabric of her pants, unclenched and utterly paralyzed. They simply surrendered, shutting down entirely, like a complex machine whose power supply had finally been permanently severed, displaying the slow, gentle recognition that she had been running on fumes for a very long time. The anchor waited, the cameras rolled, and her 13 million loyalists watched in horror as the most notoriously outspoken woman in modern politics sat paralyzed on national television with nothing left to say. She hadn't been bullied, insulted, or screamed at. She had simply been asked to explain her own math, and the reality of that basic arithmetic broke her. The waiting was still there, as patient as cold arithmetic, and as quiet as a bill sitting on a table, and it was never going away. Breaking the suffocating silence, the anchor softly cleared her throat and asked if the senator had any concluding remarks. Sitting up perfectly straight in his chair, he politely declined, dryly noting that the math simply speaks for itself. That 10-second soundbite infected the entire internet before the studio lights even managed to cool down, inflicting more permanent political damage than 30 years of coordinated opposition research ever could. Ted Cruz immediately capitalized on the slaughter with a simple 4-word post declaring somebody checked the math, while Elon Musk blasted the raw footage to his massive audience because the brutal arithmetic had already been verified by everyone watching. Even a historically hostile conservative commentator who had spent years viciously attacking the progressive star admitted awe, confessing they had never witnessed a political assassination executed entirely through polite inquiries and basic long division. The massacre was shared roughly 400,000 times before sunrise. Lingering in the shadows of a hallway outside the studio the next morning, a fellow progressive lawmaker anonymously confessed the dark truth to a journalist while entirely avoiding eye contact. He admitted that their entire modern political strategy relied heavily on theatrical outrage, which works flawlessly right up until someone in the room simply refuses to play along and decides to just sit there and do the actual math. Acknowledging the fatal flaw in their viral strategy, he quietly predicted that while she was the first to master the formula, they would continue to lose every single battle the moment they were forced to answer a math problem, because numbers do not care about emotions. Later that evening, an elite panel attempted to resuscitate her battered image by blindly praising her massive digital influence, only to be ruthlessly shut down by a co-anchor who bluntly pointed out that social media reach does not equal actionable policy. The conversation instantly died right there, because the math had already been weaponized, the questions had been laid bare, and the progressive superstar had failed to produce a single coherent answer. Unclipping his microphone with the casual, satisfied grace of a neighbor returning a borrowed tool he was glad to put down, Kennedy informed the stunned anchor in a thick, comforting Louisiana drawl that had been marinating since before the invention of television that his wife was already going to be annoyed he had taken longer than the promised 15 minutes. Walking out of the building without issuing a triumphant press release, taking a gloating victory lap, or posting a single reaction video, he did not even bother to look back at the dark studio set. He immediately boarded a flight back to Louisiana, returning to his quiet kitchen table where a simple calculator sat faithfully next to the Daily Mail. It was the exact same piece of plastic he had utilized since his early days balancing the state treasury, a device that possessed no ability to generate viral outrage, manufacture emotional speeches, or trend on any digital platform. It only understood one cold, hard reality, which was that roughly 93 trillion divided by 330 million is a massive financial burden that some ordinary citizen will eventually be forced to absorb, regardless of how loud the politicians scream on television. Someone finally grabbed a microphone and exposed the entire charade, and those 10 words were always meant for you.